A runaway girl was auctioned for $50 until the silent cowboy bought her freedom and found his own. Ghost Fork, Texas, Panhandle, August 1875. Midnight. The night market in Ghost Fork wasn't listed on any map. It drifted like a bad habit, appearing wherever the law looked the other way, and the lanterns burned longer than decency allowed. That night, beneath a sagging canvas tent strung with smoky lamps, the crowd pressed in. Men with whiskey breath and silver to spare, betting on horses, saddles, and later people. She don't talk, don't remember. $5. Take her or leave her. The voice of the auctioneer rang sharp, slicing through the dust-heavy air. A few men chuckled. One spat on the ground. On the raised plank platform stood a girl no older than 17. Her hair hung in dark knots over her shoulders. Her dress ripped at the hem and stained with travel. Her hands trembled slightly clasped in front of her, but her eyes gray as smoke were dry, hollow, like someone who had already left her body behind. She ain't got no name, the auctioneer said, patting the post behind her like he was selling a mule. No papers, no history. We just call her Ghost Girl. She came walking out of the paw scrub alone last week. You want her? She's yours. 5 flat. From the edge of the crowd, a man shifted. Boone Whitaker stood still as stone, boots powdered with trail dust, hat pulled low. He did not speak. He rarely did. Most folks assumed he could not. Others just learned to stop expecting his voice. He stepped forward, his coat brushing past shoulders, and held up 5 worn silver dollars, tarnished, but honest. He didn't raise them high, just enough, then let them fall into the tin bucket beside the auctioneer with a sound that rang louder than any bid ever had. The crowd stilled. A few men exchanged looks. One draw, hell, Whitaker, you buy in silence to match your own. Boone said nothing. His eyes, dark as molasses and twice as heavy, stayed fixed on the girl. She looked at him once, just once. But in that glance, something shifted. Not recognition, not hope, but maybe a pause in her falling. Sold, the auctioneer grunted, pushing the coins into his vest and giving the girl a shove toward the edge of the stage. She didn't move fast. She didn't look back. Boone stepped forward and took her elbow gently, not to drag, not to own, just to guide. Together, they walked through the gap the crowd had opened. Laughter followed low and mocking. She's yours, ghost and all, someone called. But then a hand reached out, grabbing the girl's wrist. Let's see what $5 bought you, cowboy. Boone stopped. He did not speak. He just looked. Slowly, his hand moved to the side of his duster, where the hilt of his revolver rested in the worn leather holster. His fingers never closed around it. Didn't need to. The man let go. Silence followed them out of the tent. Outside, the night was cleaner. Stars wheeled overhead, and the moon cast a thin silver ribbon across the trail north. Boone walked beside the girl, never behind, never ahead. When they reached his horse, an aging Mustang named Flint, he offered her the saddle blanket. She wrapped it around herself without question. Still no words passed between them. He mounted, then extended a gloved hand. She hesitated, looked at him, then took it. They rode without speaking, south of the mesa, west into the canyons, where the wind had secrets and the rocks had seen more blood than law. When they reached the old cabin nestled in the trees, Boone dismounted first. He led her to the door, unlocked it with a rusted iron key, and stepped aside so she could enter. Inside was modest wooden floor, stone hearth, a cot in the corner, and another rolled beside it. A table, 2 chairs, a lantern still burning low. She stepped in slow and quiet. He followed, shut the door, and bolted it once. On the table he placed a tin cup of water, then stepped back. The girl stared at it, then at him. Still nothing was said. Still nothing needed to be. Boone gestured to the cot, then to himself, showing where he'd sleep, showing the space was hers. Then, without a word, he lit a second lantern, walked out, and disappeared into the barn, leaving the door ajar. Inside, she stood still a long time. Then very slowly, she picked up the cup and drank. Not because she trusted him, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, no one had told her what to do, only shown her the choice. The ride to Last Canyon took a full day and part of a night. Boone did not speak, and the girl, still called nothing, did not ask. She sat behind him on Flint's saddle, her hands holding the cantle loosely, her chin tucked beneath his duster. The trail narrowed as they reached the canyon, winding between red rock and sagebrush, with the moon a pale witness above them. When they reached the cabin, Boone dismounted without a word. The girl followed. Her dress was still torn, and dust clung to her feet like shadow. But she stood straight, eyes watching every movement like a caged animal, trying to decide if the new walls were safer than the old ones. The cabin wasn't much: hand-cut pine, patched roof, a porch that groaned with memory. Boone unlocked the door with a brass key and opened it slowly. He stepped aside, waiting. She looked at him, then at the open dark, then crossed the threshold. He lit the oil lamp, revealing the inside. One room, low ceiling, cool air, a cot against the wall, a table, and 2 chairs, a shelf with a few worn books. The hearth was cold, but ready. Boone didn't speak. He simply stepped to the table and set down a square of pine wood. She glanced down on the wood. 2 lines had been carved in deep, steady strokes. You can leave or stay. No names, no explanations, just that. She did not touch the block, but her shoulders loosened slightly. Boone pointed to the bed, then to himself, gesturing toward the blanket rolled beside the hearth. The message was clear. The bed was hers. The fire was his. There were no locks, no threats, just silence. That night he slept lightly. He heard the creak of floorboards, the shift of blanket, the soft breath of someone trying not to cry, but she did not run. By morning, she was sitting on the porch, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the sun rise over the canyon's rim. She did not move when he brought her a cup of water and a strip of cornbread. She only took it gently, nodded once, and stared at the cliffs as the light climbed. Day 2 passed the same. Boone went to check the traps he'd set higher up the pass. When he returned, he found the floor swept and the chipped cup from breakfast rinsed and turned upside down to dry. She was on the porch again, braiding a strip of fabric from her torn dress into a loop. He said nothing, just nodded. On the 3rd day, Boone left something else on the table. It was a leather-bound notebook frayed at the corners. Beside it, a stub of pencil sharpened with a knife. On the first page he had printed carefully, "Write what you remember." She stared at it for a long time. That night, after Boone returned from splitting firewood, the notebook was still untouched. But by morning, he saw the page had changed in shaky but clear letters. 3 words had been written. "I saw fire," and underneath in smaller print, "Then nothing." Boone sat for a long time staring at those words. Then he turned the notebook around, took the pencil, and wrote beneath her line, "Sometimes nothing is a mercy." He left the notebook open, and went to tend the horse. That evening, she added something else. "A necklace, blue stones. I lost it." He answered, "Some things find their way back." They did not speak, but their conversation grew. On day 5, she mended a torn seam on one of his shirts and laid it folded on his bedroll. On day 6, he brought her a tin comb and a fresh bar of soap wrapped in cloth. She began sweeping the porch, feeding the chickens, stirring the stew without being asked, and each night the notebook filled with fragments. Bella's silver cup. Someone screaming, "I was running. I fell. He said my name, but I forgot." Boone never pushed for more. On the 7th night, she stood by the hearth while Boone patched a boot. The flames crackled and shadows danced along the ceiling. She pointed to the old saddle resting by the door. He looked up. She made a motion slow and clear, 2 fingers over her heart, then outward like wind. Then she touched her own chest. Understood. She didn't remember her name, but she was trying to reclaim it. He stood, walked to the saddle, and pulled out his carving knife. From a leftover scrap of leather, he cut a small tag. He handed it to her along with the pencil. She stared down at it. Then in neat, careful letters, she wrote, "Eliza, it wasn't a memory. Not yet. But it was a beginning." And that night, for the first time, Boone did not sleep beside the hearth. He unrolled his blanket near the door, but when he looked back, he saw the cot untouched. She had taken the chair, facing the window, facing the night, because maybe, just maybe, she believed she wasn't running anymore. The morning sun was soft that day, filtered through thin clouds and the rustling cottonwoods behind the cabin. Boone had gone to clear brush along the south ridge, and Eliza, still adjusting to the weight of that borrowed name, busied herself around the barn. She had taken to work with a quiet focus, feeding the chickens, patching the saddle blanket, sweeping the porch. But that day she pushed open the old barn door and stepped inside, brushing past cobwebs and dust that smelled of horses long gone. The light slanted through the cracked roof, and everything was hushed like a memory waiting to be unearthed. She started with the tack wall, sorting ropes from harnesses. Then under a rotted feed barrel, her fingers brushed against cloth. She knelt, pulled it free. A handkerchief, faded linen, once white on one corner, barely legible and thread-worn by time. 2 letters remained. The R. She stared at it, her breath catching in her chest. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded it, walked back to the cabin, and laid it on the table next to the notebook Boone had given her. When Boone returned later that afternoon, he found the handkerchief neatly smoothed and underneath it a note in her careful handwriting. "It's mine, I think." Boone studied the letters. He looked at the cloth, then walked to the back shelf and pulled out an old roll of township maps he had once used when working cattle trails. He unrolled them on the table, scanning until he found what he was looking for. There, Remington Ranch. It lay just north of a town called Hollow Bluff, and beside it, scribbled in faded ink near the ledger margin, a name, Eliza Remington. Boone turned slowly toward her. She stood in the doorway, watching, her arms crossed, but not defensive, just waiting. Hope he pointed to the name. Her eyes followed, locked on it. "Eliza," he said softly. The first word he had spoken in days. She didn't flinch. Her lips parted, but she didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the table, touched the map, then nodded once small. She would wear the name, even if it wasn't whole yet, even if the pieces were scattered in her mind like ash. That night, after dinner, Boone brought out something he hadn't touched in years. A battered harmonica, dented at one edge, but still able to sing. He sat by the fire, said nothing, and began to play. It was a simple tune, low and steady, something like a lullaby made for open skies and sleeping colts. Eliza sat at the table, arms folded, eyes half-lit. Then suddenly, without warning, she gasped. The sound was small, but sharp like a thread snapping. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled without shame. Boone stopped playing. She shook her head, not to stop him, but to hold something back. She whispered, barely audible. That song, her first full sentence. Boone blinked. She looked at him, eyes wild with something between joy and fear. I knew at once. And then she cried. They're not from pain, but from the cracking open of something once sealed, too tight. He did not reach for her. He only placed the harmonica on the table, stood and stoked the fire. Behind him, she cried alone, but not as a ghost anymore. That night, before the lamps dimmed, she wrote a final note in the journal. If my name is Eliza, then maybe I wasn't lost. Maybe I was just waiting to be found. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both accepted. Boone rose early, chopped wood, checked the traps. Eliza followed close behind, quieter than wind, but no longer afraid of it. She'd learned how to ride by watching him, and when he finally gave her a tired old mare named Midge, she climbed on without hesitation. She gripped the reins awkwardly at first, but after a week of riding along the creek and between the scrub pines, she rode like someone who had always known the rhythm of hooves. Boone carved her a wooden pistol just the right size for her hand and spent quiet afternoons showing her how to aim with it, lining up pine cones along the fence and watching her knock them down one by one. It wasn't about fighting. It was about control, confidence, choice. At night, Eliza wrote. She filled pages with broken memories. None in order, none fully whole. There was a garden, red shutters, a woman's voice singing. My name was called once and it sounded right. He said I'd ruin everything. I ran before he could. Boone read her words when she left them open. He never asked. She never told. They lived like two ghosts given a second life. Quiet, unfinished, free of yesterday until the knock. It was mid-morning and the cabin smelled of salt baking in the hearth. Boone had just come back from the lower ridge with fresh water, his boots dusty, his brow damp. Eliza was kneeling by the fire, hands deep in dough, face strewn with flour and sun. The knock was soft, too soft for a stranger. Boone stepped to the door, opened it slowly. A man stood there, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, travel-worn coat hanging from his shoulders. He smiled too fast. Morning, the stranger said. Name's Ray Carter. Looking for a trail that leads back to Hollow Bluff. You know the way. Boone's eyes narrowed. Why? The man shrugged. Just passing through. Heard there might be a bounty out that way. Boone didn't move. But behind him, the dough balls slipped. Eliza had frozen. Her hands trembled. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the noise, curious. You got company? Boone stepped forward just enough to block the view inside. Ain't no trail through here, he said evenly. Best you ride back. The man studied him for a beat too long, then tipped his hat and walked off. When Boone turned around, Eliza was gone. He found her in the old root cellar beneath the cabin, curled up behind the potato crates, breathing too fast, eyes too wide. He sat beside her, said nothing, just waited. When she finally looked at him, she whispered, he had a badge once. Boone didn't. Ask more. That night, they packed. He saddled Flint and MIJ, loaded a week's worth of supplies, and left the cabin behind. They rode east, staying off main trails, hugging the dry ravines and narrow ridgelines only mountain men knew. Eliza didn't speak much, but she rode steady. Never once asked where they were going. She knew better than to want certainty. She'd lived too long in the in-between. 3 days later, they passed through a wind-blown crossing where the desert gave way to dry grassland. There was a trading post and a small crowd, nothing more than a pop-up market with canvas tents, loud voices, and kids chasing chickens through dust. Boone stopped to water the horses. Eliza dismounted, hands on the reins, when a boy no older than 6 ran straight into her. He was crying, Ma's gone. I lost her. Eliza knelt instinctively. The boy's cheeks were streaked with dirt and his breath hitched. Boone stepped forward, but Eliza raised a hand, not to stop him, but to say, I got this. She reached into her satchel, pulled out a piece of paper from her notebook, and drew quick certain strokes. A square for the tents, a circle for the well, arrows for the paths between wagons. She handed the boy the map, pointed to the spot with the check mark. She took his hand, turned him, and gently pushed. The boy nodded, clutched the paper, and ran. Boone said nothing, but Eliza stood taller. Not because she remembered who she was, but because in that moment, she became someone again, someone who helped, someone who gave direction, someone real, and when she looked at Boone afterward, something quiet passed between them. Not a name, not a question, just a truth. Even ghosts can come back to life. Dunn Hollow looked like any other sun-baked town pressed into the red clay hills of the Texas Panhandle. But Boone Whitaker knew better the moment he stepped off his horse. The glances that lingered too long. The sheriff's office missing a door but still hanging a badge. And the crooked sign above the mercantile that read Hazleton. Boone said nothing as he helped Eliza down. Her hair was tucked under his coat collar, her harmonica case clutched tight. They were strangers here, and that was the point. At the end of the main street sat their destination, a former apothecary turned law office. Boone knocked once and let Eliza enter first. Inside, Hal Norris looked up. Once a federal lawyer, now a relic with dusty files and half a bottle of bourbon hidden beneath the floor, Boone didn't speak. He didn't have to. Al studied Eliza. Not her clothes or face, but her posture. Like someone who hadn't always been afraid, but learned to be. "Eliza Remington?" he asked. She stiffened. Boone tensed. But Eliza didn't run. Slowly, she reached into her coat and handed Hal a handkerchief embroidered with ear and a page from her notebook. In her careful script, it read, "I remember the letters. The garden, the man with ink on his hands. I sent something to you." Hal sat down hard. 5 years ago, he whispered. "I got and signed letters about land fraud, hush money, dirty deals. They stopped the day the mayor's house burned and his daughter vanished." He looked at Boone. She was the whistleblower. Eliza clutched her harmonica tighter. She hadn't spoken since the ravine, but her eyes said enough. "That means she's in danger," Hal said. "If anyone finds out, they already have." Boone said a man followed us. She recognized him. Ex-law. Hal's face darkened. He pulled a thick folder from his drawer. "This is what they burned my old office for." 1. Original deed schematic. Off the books. Then the dog outside barked. A window shattered. The first bottle hit the drapes. Flames bloomed. "Move!" Boone shouted. Hal grabbed the folder. Eliza froze. Boone didn't. He scooped her up and burst out the back. The door flying off its hinges as fire roared behind them. The office went up like tinder. Old papers, dry wood, and the vengeance of men who wanted the truth dead. In the alley, Boone dragged them behind crates. No help came. Not when Hazelton's men were involved. Boone covered Eliza's mouth with a cloth, tried to calm her breathing. She was scared, but not broken. Not this time. She still held the folder. Ash rained like judgment from above. The office was gone, but not the evidence. Hal coughed beside them. They wanted the last copy destroyed. "I didn't get it," Boone said. Eliza looked at the fire, eyes no longer hollow. She passed the folder back to Hal, then opened her notebook and with trembling fingers wrote, "Let's finish it." That night, they didn't sleep. Boone kept his rifle loaded. Hal drafted a plan and Eliza, in the glow of a stolen lamp, rewrote the testimony she once mailed in secret. This time it would not be anonymous. And Boone, he wouldn't run. In a town built on silence, they would make the truth loud enough to burn. The fire had left a scar behind Hal's office, blackened wood, and the twisted skeletons of what once held secrets. But in the abandoned mill outside Stone Hollow, under a lantern hung low from a ceiling beam, Boone and Eliza sat across from each other, with more truth between them than either had spoken in years. Boone had been quiet most of the night, working his hands along the grain of his rifle stock like it might steady something deeper. Eliza waited, as she always did, not with impatience, but with a kind of knowing calm. When he finally looked at her, it was like watching a door creak open that had long since rusted shut. "My name, Boone." "Whitaker," he said slowly, voice growled by dust and time. "Ain't the name I was born with. It's the one I chose." After I got out, Eliza tilted her head slightly. "Wasn't a killer," he said. "But they made me one. Wrong place, wrong card game, wrong badge. Walking through the wrong saloon. I took the blame. 5 years in Leavenworth." He met her eyes. "That's where I learned silence." She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. "I came out meaner than I went in," he admitted. "Wore a new name like a second skin. Figured I could vanish if I was quiet enough." Eliza reached over to the notebook she always kept close. And opened to the first page, the one where her handwriting was still jagged, scared. Boone had seen that page a dozen times. But this time she touched it gently, then laid her hand flat over it. "We both lived lies," she said softly, her voice like a breath through cracked glass. "But we chose truth now." Boone looked down, his jaw set. Then slowly something shifted. Eliza, he said, not like a question, not like a name he'd found, but like one he'd finally accepted. You got your name back. You keep it. Her lips curved into the smallest smile. She didn't need to reply. Her hand was still over the notebook, and that said enough. The silence between them was warm now. Not heavy, not afraid, just honest. Boone leaned back and exhaled. We can't stay here. Eliza nodded. They'll come looking, he added. Hazelton ain't finished. That file's enough to bury him, if it ever makes it to the circuit judge. She picked up a piece of charcoal and scrolled on a scrap of brown paper torn from the grocery sack. Then we carry it ourselves. Boone stared at the words. Back to Ghost Fork. She met his gaze steady. Boone chuckled once low and dry. You sure you're ready to walk into the devil's parlor? Knocking on his door. Eliza lifted the harmonica case she never let go of. Opened it. Inside was the folded handkerchief, a page from her journal, and the deed schematic Hal had rescued, all tucked together, she said. We've both been ghosts long enough. Boone nodded, stood, holstered his revolver. For what it's worth, he said, voice softer now. I never meant to keep running. I just forgot what it felt like to have something worth standing for. Eliza stepped beside him. You remember now, she said. And together they packed up what little they owned, truths and names and all, and rode toward Ghost Fork, not as fugitives, not as shadows, but as two souls who'd finally decided the truth was not a thing to survive alone. The hall at Ghost Fork had not seen a crowd like this in years. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of townsfolk, hats and laps, silence thick in the hot air. The word hearing was scratched in charcoal behind a shaky podium. There was no judge, no gavel. Only Eliza Remington, no longer the ghost girl, standing behind them. Boone Whitaker stood behind her, silent as always, but unshakable. I was born here, Eliza began, her voice clear, though her hands trembled. Eliza Remington, daughter of Mayor Franklin Remington. 5 years ago I disappeared. She held up the brittle papers from Hal Norris's satchel. They said, I ran. They said, I betrayed my family. But I ran because I saw what they were doing. Land deeds signed away to criminals. County records erased. Power traded for silence. Gasps spread through the crowd like sparks. Some whispered, others stiffened. Hal stepped beside her, holding out a scorched folder. These records survived the fire that was meant to destroy them. They matched the missing documents from the mayor's office 5 years ago. Eliza's voice grew firmer. My father wasn't alone. Acting Mayor Green continued the same game, and when I returned, they tried to erase me all over again. From the back, a voice growled, You got no proof. 3 of Green's men pushed through the crowd. You call this justice? One spat. She's a runaway. He's a convict. Then the first man raised his gun. Boone was already moving, but not fast enough. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Boone stepped between Eliza and the barrel. The bullet caught him in the side. He grunted, fell to his knees. No! Eliza screamed, catching him as blood spread across his shirt. The room exploded in chaos. Shouts, panic, iron drawn. But Hal Norris roared, Stand down! Eliza held Boone tight. Her voice broke as she cried out, He's not nobody. He's Boone Whitaker and he saved me. The crowd went still. Howell raised his hands. Boone Whitaker served 5 years for a crime he didn't commit. He's lived under a false name, hunted for a past that wasn't his fault, and today he chose to bleed for someone else's truth. A man in the crowd called out, He saved my son's cattle, another. He pulled my brother from a flood. The mood shifted, not with violence, but resolve. People moved, not in fear, but unity. Green's men, outnumbered, dropped their weapons. Some backed out the door. Others were restrained. Hal held up the folder, now stained with soot and blood. These crimes won't be buried. Not again. As Boone was lifted to a stretcher, Eliza walked beside him, her hand on his chest, her eyes never leaving his face. She looked back at the townsfolk and said, "He gave me my name back. It's time this town remembered its own." The doors opened to a sky painted gold with late afternoon. The wind had shifted. The silence had ended. And in the space left behind, justice finally took root. The cell in Ghost Fork's modest jailhouse was cleaner than Boone expected. Not that it mattered. He knew steel bars when he saw them, and the name on the intake log, Boone Whitaker, alias of Elias Rohr, sealed his stay. But he sat straight, arms folded, expression steady. No fear, just the waiting of a man who had stopped running. It was Eliza who walked in with Hal Norris and the new mayor, a stout woman named Marjorie Kelt, who had once kept the post office and now ran the town with calm hands and clearer eyes. She carried the signed pardon herself, walked past the sheriff's desk and unlocked the door without ceremony. "Eliza's statement stands," she said, voice firm. "You were hunted for the name they gave you, not the man you chose to become. The court sees the difference. You're free." Boone stood slowly. He looked to Eliza. She didn't smile. Not yet. But her hand reached for his and gripped it hard. In silence, she led him outside. They didn't go back to her father's estate. That place was stone and shame. Instead, they rode quietly, without parade, back to the hills above Lass, where the shack still leaned sideways in the wind, and the chicken still scratched the dust near the porch. There, Eliza unpacked the only thing she'd taken from her past, a small harmonica and a worn notebook, pages half filled with ink and ash. They built a life one morning at a time. Boone repaired the fence, Eliza grew herbs by the window. Every dawn before she rose, he'd leave a sliver of fresh bread on the windowsill beside a sprig of wildflower. Not grand, just there, like breath, like forgiveness. The townsfolk, once curious, became kind. They didn't pry. Sometimes a neighbor dropped off flour. Sometimes a girl from the schoolhouse came to borrow a book. And once Hal Norris rode up with a package of blank journals tied in twine. "Eliza's earned her ink," he said, tipping his hat. But it wasn't until the morning she carved the sign that Boone understood just how much had changed. He found her at the gate, hammer in hand, tapping a wooden plank into place between two fence posts. The words were burned deep into the grain, steady and proud. "Home where no one runs anymore." Boone looked at her. "You sure?" he asked. Eliza nodded. "You're not running. And I'm not hiding." He stared at the words a moment longer, then reached out, took her hand, and kissed her fingers, callous now, but warm. A year passed like a wind through wheat. On a spring afternoon, beneath the same oak tree, where he'd once taught her how to fire a wooden rifle, they stood again, this time surrounded by wildflowers and friends, who no longer asked questions. Eliza wore a simple cream dress, her hair braided with blue thread. Boone stood beside her in his old shirt, the collar stiff but clean. There was no preacher, no vows. Only Hal, reading a single line from her journal. She stayed, he stayed, and that was enough. At the end, a little girl, barefoot and wild-haired, ran between them, clutching a wooden toy horse. She squealed, "Ma, Pa," before tumbling into Boone's arms. Eliza scooped her close, laughing through quiet tears. Boone lifted his daughter high. The sunlight hit her face and his heart at once. He looked up at the sky, eyes wet. But steady. Then he whispered for no one but the wind and the woman beside him to hear. "No name, no chains, just us." If this story stirred something deep in you, if Boone's quiet strength and Eliza's unspoken courage made you believe in second chances, in homes built from healing, and in love that doesn't need permission, then this is just the beginning. At Wild West Love Stories, we bring you true-hearted tales from the frontier, where names can be false, but loyalty never is. Where silence can say more than 1,000 words and where even a $5 choice can lead to a forever kind of love. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories now. Because out here under the wide open sky, we believe in redemption, in grit, in love that stays, and in stories that live long after the dust settles.